Let me ask you something quietly. Honestly, have you noticed how starting a relationship at 40 or 50 feels very different than it did in your 20s? Not harder. Different. Heavier. In my clinic, people often lower their voice when they say this, almost as if they're ashamed of thinking it. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one warns you about. At this age, love doesn't just open the heart. It activates old wounds, survival instincts, and deeply wired brain patterns that were asleep for decades. And if you don't understand what's happening inside your mind, a relationship that begins with hope can slowly turn into quiet, emotional damage. Now let me speak to you not as a motivational speaker, but as a doctor who has watched this unfold hundreds of times. When you start a relationship later in life, your brain is no longer wired for exploration, it is wired for protection. In your 20s, the brain is dominated by dopamine-driven novelty. Risk feels exciting. Attachment forms quickly. Mistakes are brushed off. But by 40 or 50, your nervous system has learned loss, disappointment, betrayal, and grief. Even if you think you've moved on, your limbic system remembers. It always remembers. In my consultations, I often see people confused by their own reactions. They say, "Doctor, why do I overthink so much now? Why do small things scare me? Why do I feel anxious even when the person is kind?" This is not weakness. This is pattern memory. Your brain has spent decades collecting emotional data. It has built protective shortcuts. The amygdala, the brain's threat detector, becomes faster with age, not slower. It scans for danger before your heart even gets a chance to feel joy. This is something no one talks about. At this stage of life, love is filtered through accumulated experiences. Every new connection unconsciously asks, will this cost me my peace? Will I have to rebuild again? Do I have the energy to survive another ending? And here's the risk. Many people mistake emotional caution for maturity, when in reality, it's often unresolved fear wearing a calm mask. I've seen people enter relationships not because they feel emotionally safe, but because they fear loneliness. The brain, under chronic loneliness, releases cortisol, the stress hormone, which quietly pushes people toward attachment even when compatibility is low. So the first danger isn't choosing the wrong person. It's choosing from a place of emotional depletion. As a doctor, I say this gently but firmly. If you start a relationship at this age without understanding how your brain has changed, you may blame yourself for reactions that are entirely neurological. And that misunderstanding can slowly erode your self-worth. This is only the beginning of what we need to talk about. Let me tell you something I often say behind closed clinic doors, when the room is quiet and the patient is finally honest. At 40 or 50, you are not just choosing a partner, you are choosing a future version of your nervous system. What most people don't realize is that at this age, relationships don't merely affect your emotions, they rewire your stress response, your sleep, your focus, even your physical health. And this is where the second major risk begins, the silent collision between emotional attachment and an already tired nervous system. In younger years, the brain has a remarkable ability to absorb emotional shocks and recover. Neuroplasticity is high. The body forgives quickly. But later in life, your nervous system is no longer elastic, it is adaptive, and adaptation comes with limits. In my consultation, I often see people who say, "Doctor, I don't fight. I don't argue. I just shut down." They think this is emotional control. It isn't. This is emotional conservation. By midlife, the brain has learned that prolonged emotional conflict is expensive. It raises blood pressure, disrupts sleep, increases inflammation, and keeps cortisol elevated. So instead of fighting, the nervous system chooses withdrawal. Here is the risk. When you start a relationship at this age, emotional suppression can masquerade as stability. You may tolerate behaviors you would never have accepted before, not because you're wiser, but because your system wants peace at any cost. You stop expressing needs. You minimize discomfort. You tell yourself, it's not worth the stress. But the brain does not erase unmet needs. It stores them. Over time, suppressed emotions don't disappear. They convert into somatic symptoms. Headaches, fatigue, digestive issues, chest tightness, a vague sense of heaviness you can't explain. This is something no one warns you about. I've seen relationships where nothing appears wrong on the surface, yet one partner slowly loses vitality. They become quieter, less expressive, less alive. Not because the relationship is abusive, but because it is emotionally mismatched. At 40 or 50, emotional mismatch is more dangerous than open conflict. Conflict can be processed. Mismatch slowly drains the nervous system. Another risk lies in attachment styles that have hardened over decades. If you've lived independently for many years, your brain has wired autonomy as safety. Suddenly sharing emotional space, routines, expectations, it can feel intrusive rather than intimate. People often mislabel this discomfort as "I'm not made for relationships anymore." In reality, it's your brain resisting a sudden loss of control. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many midlife relationships fail not because of lack of love, but because both nervous systems are protecting themselves instead of bonding. When two guarded brains meet, intimacy becomes effortful. As a doctor, I always say this gently. Love at this age requires more self-awareness than passion. Without it, the relationship becomes another source of quiet exhaustion. And exhaustion, over time, is corrosive. There is a sentence I hear very often in my practice, usually spoken with a nervous smile. "Doctor, I don't want drama anymore. I just want peace." On the surface, that sounds healthy, mature, reasonable. But what most people don't realize is that this desire for peace at midlife can quietly push them into emotionally unsafe relationships. Not explosive ones, but numbing ones. And this is where the third risk emerges, confusing emotional intensity with emotional danger and emotional emptiness with safety. By the time you reach 40 or 50, your brain has learned to associate emotional intensity with pain. Past relationships may have involved betrayal, neglect, or prolonged conflict. So the brain creates a shortcut: strong feelings equal threat. This isn't a conscious choice. It's conditioning. The amygdala, whose job is survival, becomes overly sensitive after repeated emotional injuries. It starts filtering potential partners through one question only: will this disturb my equilibrium? As a result, many people at this age unconsciously choose emotionally unavailable partners. Why? Because emotional distance feels predictable, and predictability feels safe to a nervous system that has been overwhelmed before. In my consultation room, I often hear people say, they're calm, they don't demand much, they don't get emotional, but what they don't say, at least not at first, is how lonely they feel lying next to someone who doesn't truly see them. This is something no one warns you about. At midlife, the brain's reward system has changed. Dopamine, the chemical of excitement, is no longer easily triggered by novelty. Instead, the brain seeks emotional regulation. So you may mistake emotional flatness for compatibility. But here is the danger. Emotional flatness slowly erodes your sense of being desired, chosen, and emotionally met. I've seen people who look stable from the outside, but slowly lose their emotional vocabulary. They stop sharing dreams, fears, or inner thoughts, not because they don't have them, but because there is no emotional resonance on the other side. Over time, the brain adapts to this absence. And adaptation is not healing. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rationalizing choices, often steps in and says, "This is fine. At least there's no chaos." but the emotional brain feels something else entirely, a dull ache, a quiet dissatisfaction that grows louder in moments of solitude. Another risk at this stage is the belief that compromise equals maturity. Yes, compromise is healthy, but chronic self-abandonment is not. If you find yourself shrinking to maintain peace, your nervous system is not safe. It is silenced. And silenced emotions don't disappear. They resurface later as regret, resentment, or a sense that life somehow became smaller. As a doctor, I want you to hear this clearly. Peace without emotional connection is not peace. It's emotional anesthesia. And long-term emotional anesthesia has consequences. There is a quiet fear I hear again and again, usually after a long pause. Doctor, what if this is my last chance? It's said softly, almost apologetically. And this fear, more than loneliness, more than desire, drives some of the most dangerous relationship decisions after 40 or 50. Because when the brain believes time is running out, it stops asking healthy questions and starts making survival bargains. This is where the fourth risk begins, urgency hijacking judgment. From a neurological perspective, the perception of limited time changes how the brain evaluates choices. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term thinking, becomes less influential when fear of scarcity activates the limbic system. In simple terms, the brain shifts from, is this right for me, to what if there's nothing else? In my consultation, I often see intelligent, emotionally aware people suddenly tolerate behaviors they would have immediately rejected in their younger years, not because they approve of them, but because they are afraid of ending up alone. This is something no one warns you about. At midlife, attachment fear doesn't scream, it whispers. It says, maybe I'm asking for too much. Maybe this is just how relationships are at this age. Maybe I should be grateful someone is here. The brain, under fear of abandonment, releases cortisol. Over time, cortisol narrows perspective. It reduces emotional clarity and increases self-doubt. You begin questioning your own needs rather than the situation. I've watched people slowly negotiate away their boundaries, not in dramatic moments, but in small, daily concessions. They stop bringing up concerns. They delay difficult conversations. They accept emotional inconsistency as normal. And here's the danger. When boundaries erode gradually, you don't feel violated, you feel tired. Another layer of risk appears when people rush emotional intimacy. At this age, emotional closeness can feel intoxicating because it fills long-standing gaps. The brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, which creates a powerful sense of connection. But oxytocin does not discriminate between healthy and unhealthy bonds. I often say this in my clinic: emotional closeness is not evidence of emotional safety. When intimacy is accelerated without trust being tested over time, the brain may attach before reality has been fully observed. Red flags get reinterpreted as quirks. Inconsistencies get labeled as stress. And once attachment forms, leaving becomes neurologically harder. As a doctor, I need to say this clearly and compassionately. Choosing from fear shortens your emotional lifespan. You may not notice it immediately, but years later, many people sit across from me and say, I knew something was wrong from the beginning. I just didn't listen. Your intuition does not disappear with age. It gets quieter when fear gets louder. There's a moment I often recognize before my patients do. Their relationship hasn't ended. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet something inside them has gone quiet. They say, Doctor, I don't feel like myself anymore. And this is one of the most overlooked risks of starting a relationship later in life. The slow loss of identity that happens when two fully formed lives try to merge without flexibility. By 40 or 50, you are no longer becoming who you are. You already are. Your routines, values, coping mechanisms, and sense of self have been shaped over decades. This stability can be a strength, but it also makes adaptation harder. In neurological terms, your brain has established strong default networks. These are patterns that resist change, even when change is needed. In my consultation, I often see couples struggling not with love, but with lifestyle collision. One person is deeply independent. The other seeks emotional merging. Neither is wrong, but the nervous systems are incompatible. This is something no one warns you about. At this stage, compromise is no longer just behavioral, it's neurological. When you repeatedly override your natural rhythms to accommodate a partner, the brain experiences internal conflict. Over time, this conflict creates emotional fatigue. People often describe it as, I'm always adjusting, I'm always explaining myself, I'm always holding something back. And slowly, the brain begins to conserve energy by narrowing expression. You become less spontaneous, less curious, less emotionally alive. Another risk emerges when people confuse relationship stability with self-sacrifice. They say, I'm just being mature, but maturity should expand your capacity, not shrink it. I've seen individuals abandon long-held passions, friendships, even values, not because their partner demanded it outright, but because emotional friction felt too exhausting to manage. The nervous system chooses peace over authenticity. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Losing yourself rarely feels dramatic. It feels practical. And the brain rewards practicality with temporary relief. Less conflict, less tension. But the cost is paid later, in the form of regret, resentment, or a vague sense of invisibility. Another layer of danger lies in the belief that change should be easier at this age. When it isn't, people blame themselves. They think, why can't I adapt like I used to? But the reality is biological. Neuroplasticity decreases with age. Change requires more emotional energy. And when that energy is constantly spent on relationship adjustment, there's little left for personal growth. As a doctor, I say this carefully. A relationship that requires you to disappear, even slowly, is not sustainable, no matter how calm it looks from the outside. Because eventually, the self that has been suppressed will demand space. And when it does, it often does so painfully. There is a question I sometimes ask gently after listening for a long time. When was the last time you felt emotionally safe? Not just calm, but safe. The room often goes quiet after that, because many people realize, for the first time, that what they call a good relationship at this age is actually a low-conflict arrangement, not an emotionally secure bond. And this leads us to one of the most serious risks of starting a relationship later in life, mistaking absence of pain for presence of safety. By 40 or 50, your nervous system is highly skilled at avoiding threat. It knows how to read tone shifts, how to predict mood changes, how to prevent arguments before they happen. This can look like emotional intelligence, but very often, it's hypervigilance. In my clinical experience, I see many individuals who have become experts at keeping relationships smooth. They anticipate needs. They regulate the other person's emotions. They self-edit constantly. What they don't realize is that this level of emotional monitoring keeps the nervous system in a low-grade stress response. Cortisol doesn't spike dramatically. It hums quietly in the background. This is something no one warns you about. At midlife, chronic low-level stress is far more damaging than acute conflict. It disrupts sleep architecture, it affects memory and concentration. It accelerates emotional burnout. I've had patients say, "Doctor, nothing is wrong, but I'm always tired." And when we explore further, the fatigue isn't physical, it's relational. Another risk at this stage is the fear of emotional exposure. After years of self-reliance, vulnerability feels risky, so people share selectively. They keep certain fears, insecurities, or needs hidden, not because the partner is unsafe, but because opening up feels destabilizing. But emotional safety requires exposure. When vulnerability is avoided, intimacy becomes performative. You show the version of yourself that is acceptable, reasonable, easy to love, and over time, the parts of you that need care remain unseen. The brain registers this as isolation, even inside a relationship. From a neuroscience perspective, emotional safety activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the state where healing, bonding, and rest occur. Without it, the body stays in mild defense mode. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Many relationships at this age are emotionally polite, but neurologically unsafe. They don't harm you loudly. They drain you quietly. As a doctor, I often say this. If you can't fully exhale emotionally around someone, your body knows it, even if your mind keeps justifying the relationship. And the body, eventually, will demand relief. Before we end, I want you to pause for a moment and listen carefully. If starting a relationship at 40 or 50 feels confusing, exhausting, or strangely heavy, you are not broken. In my clinic, the people who struggle the most are often the most self-aware, the most emotionally deep. What no one tells you is this: later life relationships don't fail because people are incapable of love. They fail because love now requires a level of psychological honesty most people were never taught. And this is the final, most important risk: entering a relationship without understanding your own emotional patterns. By this stage of life, your relationship history has shaped your attachment style deeply. Whether you lean avoidant, anxious, or somewhere in between, these patterns are no longer flexible tendencies. They are neurological habits. In my consultations, I often hear people say, "I thought I had healed." But healing isn't the absence of pain. Healing is awareness under pressure. A new relationship activates old circuits. Fear of abandonment, fear of engulfment, fear of repeating past mistakes. And here's the uncomfortable truth. At midlife, relationships don't create wounds, they reveal them. This is why many people feel destabilized when they start dating again. The brain, encountering emotional closeness, replays unresolved emotional memories. Not consciously, somatically, through anxiety, withdrawal, irritability, or emotional numbness. Another risk lies in outsourcing emotional regulation to a partner. After years of independence, it's tempting to let someone else soothe loneliness, insecurity, or unresolved grief. But when a relationship becomes your primary emotional regulator, it carries a heavy psychological load. No human nervous system can carry that indefinitely. I often tell my patients this gently: your partner can walk beside you. They cannot carry your inner world for you. The healthiest later life relationships I've seen share one quality: not chemistry, not passion, but emotional responsibility. Each person understands their triggers, their fears, their patterns. They don't expect love to fix what awareness hasn't addressed. So let me leave you with this. As a doctor, and as someone who has watched love unfold in all its forms, starting a relationship at 40 or 50 is not dangerous because of age. It's dangerous when people ignore the psychology of who they've become. When you understand your nervous system, your attachment style, and your emotional needs, love at this age can be deeply grounded, calm, and meaningful. But without that understanding, even a gentle relationship can quietly cost you your peace. And peace, at this stage of life, is not something you should ever gamble with.